Welcome to the Transformational podcast. We are glad you were back with us. As you noticed last week, hopefully if you did catch up, if not, you can go catch it. You got very raw audio and it did cut off right at the end. And we apologize for that. Honestly, Chris, I don't really know where it went wrong last week or what went wrong because right now it's working beautifully. And so I really don't know. Even the sound quality wasn't the best in the world, but I'll be uh, interested to see how this week's plays out. The platform we used had a software update, or I guess you could say a platform update. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but I'll continue to do my normal sound guy production stuff. I'll try to tweak it. But you did. I don't know about you, Chris. I laughed a lot last week, and maybe that was just because if I felt like I was corralling you the entire time.
I laughed a lot too. I also realized that I like do this little thing when I'm laughing where I'm like, I was like, all right, I got to stop that. Good grief. What is going on? So,
great,
this
Chris.
is my public formal apology for my mouth breathing laugh to all of you who've put up with that for years and years and years. Good night, nurse.
I don't think you'll ever stop.
I don't think I will either. I think I'm going to try, but it's just going to happen because it is what it is.
I think you just pointed it out for everybody. The other thing I was going to say is on your side, you've got quite a few people in the building today. So we may hear some activities, maybe some festivities. I don't know. What do you guys have going on?
Man, we have so much going on. It's been so loud around here today, but for all good things.
Right.
Yeah, this is Resurrection Week, man.
I know.
Exciting week,
right?
Or Passion Week is what some people call it. I like Resurrection Week.
I know.
But we've got people getting ready for services. We'll have 7 services this weekend, 3 on Saturday, 4 on Sunday, and all the things preparing for that.
But this will come out the day after, basically the day after Easter. And so I'm kind of excited to see where we go today, but go ahead. Didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah.
I like to call that day Good Monday. because we work on Good Friday. We recognize the day, but at the end of the day, we're getting ready. So we take Good Monday off instead of Good Friday. But we've got workers actually working on the building, but then we've got people getting different things will be used at Easter ready, and there's people actually right outside my office. So if you hear people, just know it's part of the preparation process, and we're pretty excited about it.
Yeah, excited to get a lot of people in your house. Of course, we're excited to get folks at our house in the over at Faith Bible, and we have a lot of really cool family way that we, I guess you could say, recognize Easter and honestly celebrate the resurrection of Christ. One of the things that was interesting is as we started, I asked you, I said, hey, I had this thing in my journal. It came out of Deuteronomy, and it wasn't any coincidence to me. I'm sure it wasn't to you as well, that we both had written stuff down in our journal about the same passage.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was clear that God was directing our conversation because it wasn't even you said this already. It wasn't even the same passage. Yeah. And
it was the same passage. I just couldn't find it.
Oh,
and
okay.
We had written down different things about the same passage. I just couldn't figure out which passage it was just because of the way the 1-year Bible. I'll do better about writing down what passage I'm writing about. But anyway, you had mentioned it, and as soon as you started reading, I was like, that's exactly where I was when I wrote this down in my journal. So it was absolutely perfect alignment. We're in what, Deuteronomy 11?
Deuteronomy 11. Now, before we go get to that, I think it's just important just to see what's going on here. Which, by the way, this is just part of our daily reading. We read this stuff, and then I typically ask myself, all right, God, what do you want me to know, and what do you want me to do? Or what does this tell me about God? What does it tell me about myself? Just easy questions, but I think that those are important questions to just draw stuff out. But this is so it answers those questions so clearly, right? It's not. I
always ask what stuck out. So I mean, it's kind of a better version of what I ask. I normally ask, "Hey, what stuck out to me?" But that's a very good way of approaching it.
So just real simple questions. But if you look back in chapter 10, I actually love verse 12 of 10. It says, "And now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? He requires only that you fear the Lord your God, live in a way that pleases him, and love and serve him with all your heart and soul. And you must always obey the Lord's commands and decrees that I'm giving to you today. Look what it says, for your own good. I
Yeah.
love that part because it's just, this is, he's delivered them from Egypt. They've come through, the wilderness, or they've part of it. They actually, I don't know exactly where they are at this point. I'm trying to look back and see because I wasn't.
They're almost at the end of it because
Okay.
that's one of the things that Moses is addressing is that, hey,
Oh,
it's
there it is.
been basically 40 years and but not me, because Moses has told them I can't go into the promised land with you, but God's
Right.
gonna take you. But anyway, that's where you're at. Now, can I take a real quick, just absolute rabbit trail for just 2 seconds, if that's
Oh
okay,
yeah.
on that
Yep. Yep.
verse? Yeah. So this morning, I was reading in Luke chapter, flip back a page, chapter 10, and I was actually Luke chapter 10, and it was in verse 25. And this religious expert asked Jesus, "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus answers him, obviously, like he always did. If you remember, he answered with a question.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Well, what does the law of Moses say, and how do you read it?" Now, at this point, there's like, what, 100? I mean, I don't know. There's a jillion laws. I don't know
Oh,
specifically.
over
You might know.
600
Yeah.
Levitical laws because they were loophole people, right? It started with 12
Right.
and they would find ways to not violate the rule and then get around it. So they just kept making these rules. Over 600, man. I mean,
Yeah.
it's impossible to.
Well, it's really cool because this is why I'm going there is because he
Yep.
asks, he's like, "What does the law of Moses say, and how do you read it?" And this expert in the religious law answered it, interestingly enough, the exact same way Jesus answered it when Jesus asked the exact same question. But the man says, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind." And then he says, "And love your neighbor as yourself." And he says, "Right, do this and you'll live." And so it's fascinating that there are that many what do we call laws, but they do get summed up here in that verse.
Right.
What is that? Deuteronomy 10:12, which is love the
Right.
Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Anyway,
Yes.
just interesting how you can see this gets pulled through from Deuteronomy all the way through when Jesus is walking. Both Jesus answers it the right way and the expert in the religious law answers it in the right way.
Yeah. And that actually comes from the Shema. Um, it's basically where a Jewish prayer, a daily prayer, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. As for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength." And so, that being said, part of the reason this is not just a passage of Scripture. This was something that they held on to, and because it's asking, what does God expect of you? And if I just want to walk through these things real quick, not going to dive deep, but he says, fear God, fear the Lord your God. What does it mean? It's like this, having a deep respect for his authority in your life.
Mm-hmm.
Not afraid of him, like he's going to hurt you, but more of a deep respect of his authority, and really there, with that respect and his understanding of his power and his might, it's there is a sense of actual fear, but not because he's a bad person, but because you do not want to experience his wrath, right? I don't know
Yeah.
how to explain it other than I think some people have tried to say there's no reason, perfect love casts out all fear. That is true. His perfect
Mm-hmm.
love on the cross that gives us the ability to not experience the consequences, the ultimate consequences of our sin, has removed that fear. However,
Yeah.
there are natural consequences to sin in general, and so we
Yeah.
have to recognize that. But at the same time, fear him, deep respect. Okay, live according to his will. Follow him and not your own will and not your own plan. Right? Love him.
Yeah.
Love him with your heart, with your life, with your soul, your strength. Worship him wholeheartedly, and obey his commands. In other words, he's just saying, hey, let God direct the way you live your life. So I think that's important because what we're about to say next, he's saying this is not just for you, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And
Right. Exactly.
a bunch of other stuff before we get to that. for the Lord your God, this is verse 17, is the God of all gods and Lord of all lords. He is the great God, the mighty and awesome God who shows no partiality and cannot be bribed. He ensures the orphans and widows receive justice, right? It just goes through all of this and just explaining who he is, right? And the things that are
Yep.
important for us to know about him. And then we get to chapter 11. And so I just think just understanding that framework is important as we step into 11 a little bit.
Well, absolutely, because part of what is happening here in verse 11, or sorry, chapter 11, is Moses is actually, because they're at the end of their time, he's addressing the entire community and he's preparing them to enter the promised land. And what's interesting is what kind of stood out to me is similar to what stood out to you in this area, which is that in preparing them, he sort of gives them a history lesson.
Right.
He gives them a history lesson. And I actually wrote, I said the two things that stand out here that I'd take away is it was a reminder for those who'd seen God work firsthand. And what's to me, one of those moments where I paused and I thought, thought about it was the folks he's talking about who saw it firsthand were all under the age of 20 when they saw it.
Right. So
Because
let's read it real quick.
Go ahead. Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So chapter 11, verse 1, you must love the Lord your God and obey all his requirements, decrees, regulations, and commands, right? He repeats himself, but here's why. He says, keep in mind that I'm not talking now to your children who have never experienced the discipline of the Lord your God or seen his greatness and his strong hand and powerful arm. They didn't see the miraculous signs and wonders he performed in Israel against Pharaoh and all his land. They didn't see what the Lord did to the armies of Egypt and to their horses and chariots, how he drowned them in the Red Sea as they were chasing you. He destroyed them, and they have not recovered to this very day. Your children didn't see how the Lord cared for you in the wilderness until you arrived. They didn't see what he did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, a descendant of Reuben, when the earth opened its mouth in the Israelite camp and swallowed them, along with their households, tents, and everything, every living thing that belonged to them. Listen, if you haven't read that part, it's back there. You should go check it out. It's a crazy story. But it says,
I know, that's what's crazy. He's covering all of the crazy stories.
Yes.
And that one right there stands out among them all, but continue. Yeah.
But you have seen the Lord perform all these mighty deeds with your own eyes. I love it because he's going, I'm talking to you, but I'm not talking to your children because they haven't seen what you've seen. And so one of the things I wrote down in my journal was just your kids haven't seen what God can do, but you have. So live in a way that sets an example for your kids. Tell them the ways that you've seen God move. Tell the stories.
Man, yes. Your kids haven't seen what God has done in your life and in the life, so tell them. And that's just so poignant because as I was running this morning, Chris, I was thinking about not only the things that he has done in our lives, but even sometimes the things they've done in their life, right? There's things that happen in their life that they can't remember, or they can't see, or whatever. And it's our responsibility as their parents to remind them, to bring that up.
Right. So what I love about it is there's this responsibility to tell them what God has done. Why? So that they will continue to follow God's way, to trust God fully. But then he goes on and talks about, hey, here's the other thing you need to tell them. Here's the other thing that's important to know. He goes on and says, verse 8, be careful to obey every command I'm giving you so you may have strength to go in and take over the land you're about to enter. In other words, you can take what I've already promised to give you, right? They're about to come back to the promised land. It says, if you obey, you'll enjoy a long life in the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors and to you and their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. But then I'm gonna go ahead and skip down.
Okay.
To verse 13. If you carefully obey all the commands I'm giving you today, and if you love the Lord your God and serve him with all your heart and soul, I love this, then he will send the rains in their proper seasons. the early and late rains, so that you can bring in your harvest of grain, new wine, olive and olive oil. He will give you lush pasture land for your livestock, and you and yourselves will have all you want to eat. Now, listen, this is a statement of complete and total provision. All right. We sometimes don't hear the idea he's going to send the rains when they need to come in proper time, because we're not an agricultural based economy really anymore at all. But this is their livelihood, and they could do everything that they wanted to do, could try to do. The reality is the one thing that they could not do is make it rain.
I know.
They could not make it rain on them. All right. They couldn't do that. That's only God could do that. That is a terrible reference. I shouldn't have made that reference. I admit it. I admit it up right now. Yes, but here's the reality. Here's the reality. That it was a recognition of total provision, but because he goes on to say, "Don't let your heart be deceived, so that you turn away from the Lord and serve and worship other gods." Don't look to other people for what only God's meant to provide, other objects, other false gods. If you do, the Lord's anger will burn against you. He will shut up the sky and hold back the rain, and the ground will fail to produce its harvest. Then you will quickly die in the land the Lord is giving you. Here's what I feel like. This is what I wrote down. Teach your kids to obey God, that He is the one who can cause you to prosper and have plenty. That you have a choice, blessing or a curse. Obedience prepares you for blessing, but disobedience always leads to a curse, to the curse. And so, it's one of those things of I think the reason this is important to me is I'm not teaching my kids to follow Jesus so they can be good Christians or so they can be religious.
Good humans. There's a lot of various things,
good
right?
humans, right? It goes back
to... That's a byproduct. Honestly, that's a beautiful byproduct. And I talk about that in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things that we do that the byproduct of the foundation of the faith, the byproduct is some of that stuff, but that's not really the point, right? The point is relational. It's relationship.
Yeah. And if it goes back even to Deuteronomy 10:13, where it says you must always obey the Lord's commands and decrees that I'm giving you today. Here it is again, or here it was. That's what he said, for your own good. Listen, why are we teaching our kids this? Because we want them to experience God's best. It's for their own good. I think often we actually do the opposite. We disregard what God has said, or because the culture doesn't see it that way. The culture doesn't do it that way. The culture doesn't think that's how we should do it. So we disregard what God has said, and we think we're doing it for their good. And the reality is that's not what leads to their good.
Yeah.
What leads to their good is raising them up to know and follow Jesus, because only then will they get the life that leads to the full and satisfying life that God has promised.
So I'd like to break this down into like three kind of packages, if that's okay, 3 bins. And you may, I don't know, just the bin, but like first bin, right, is we want to tell our kids, and we'll jump in them. I guess you could say individually after I do all 3, Chris. Anyway, the first bin is to tell them kind of the history of his faithfulness, right? A history of faithfulness. The second thing is really it's the teaching them his commands, or teaching him his
it's a little bit of his character and his...
teaching him of his character and commands. We'll leave it at that. And then maybe we can adjust it as we go. And then the last one is, and I think probably the thing that kind of brings it together is teach them relationship. Teach them how to have a relationship. Teach them the integral part of being relational. And that's part of what we're talking about with the podcast, right? Is the transformation piece, is to renew our minds. And we're going to teach them how to do the same thing, right? Because hopefully we're at least, if nothing else, maybe a half step ahead of them. I mean, not everybody's going to be like 10 years ahead of their kids. Some people may be like, I don't know, 10 days, but that's okay. God's equipping us. So let's tell of the history of the faithfulness. What's the best way to go about the tales of faithfulness, right? Because, Moses sat here and he took them through each of the big points of life, or big points that happened, which interestingly, Chris, one of the things I had written about in my journal, that had happened 40 years prior, and nothing had happened in the previous 40 years. So
Yeah.
when they were out in the desert, that was 40 years of nothing.
Yeah.
Prior to that is when all of that happened. And now when they were being reprimanded, which is what it talks about as you started Deuteronomy 11 there, nothing else was going on. And so Moses had to say to the generation that had seen it, hey, remember it, but also teach your kids.
Right.
So, from a practical standpoint, what are some ways to really open our eyes or show our kids like his faithfulness from years past? What are the best ways to introduce that, you think?
So I love this because one of the things this is kind of fun. Brock my youngest has started listening to the podcast, which
Yeah.
I absolutely love. He doesn't have a phone, but he has a watch that he can listen to it on. So he'll
Okay.
walk around with the Bluetooth headphones on, listening to it, and I love it.
It's awesome. No, it's
But he's
awesome.
listening to the stories. But I think that's the deal. It's just tell the stories, talk about it, talk about your faith, talk about where you've seen God move, and then put yourself in situations where they get to hear other people talk about what God has done.
Yeah.
Like this is why a Christian community is important. This is why inviting people over for dinner and just saying, "Man, what is God teaching? What are you showing?" And talking about the stories. Here's what's crazy is it feels weird only because we don't do it.
Yeah.
it,
Right.
it shouldn't feel weird. I remember Robert growing up, mom and dad had pastors over to our house all the time, pastors'
Yeah.
families. And we got to know our pastors at the church, not as the guy who just stood on stage and we colored while they
We had
talked,
pastors
right?
over, Chris. We had folks who were traveling through. We had people that were from the college ministry that dad was a part of, people that were part of mom's, ministries, and they would all share their stories. And in fact, I mean, even the stories about the house itself we lived in, we discussed enough times that I could probably quote them,
Yeah.
word for word now. And they were all these stories of God's faithfulness, which is why when I think about Psalms 37, when I think about this, Psalms 37:25 comes to mind, or it's 25 comes to mind. And every time I think about this is the verse that kind of comes to my mind. It rings around, which is, I was young and now I'm old, yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging for bread. They're always generous, lend freely, and the children will be a blessing. But my point being is, I was young, now I'm old, yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken. And the point that's being made there is this is a somebody who is old in the faith who's saying, hey, I've seen this. I've been, now I'm old. I've seen this. And they're passing that on. They're passing it on,
Right.
obviously, in this way in the scripture. And the same stuff, as I think back to those stories, it's either stories of provision, it's story of God's faithfulness, it's stories of God's protection. And those things were brought up. And so one of the ways, Chris, we do it practically here at this house, and, I refine it over the years. Frankly, each year and each week is a little bit different.
Right.
But I'll say something along the lines of like, when we finished up the year, which was like, hey, let's go back over some of the things God did for us this year. Let's review what we did this year and review. Let's talk about the big things that we did this year. And then let's talk about the ways that God blessed us in those things.
Right.
And so I probably could do, be more intentional weekly and monthly, but that's the 1 year thing that we do. And of course, my kids have listened to the podcast at times, and they do enjoy some of the stories of faith that we get to talk about. So yeah, make it not awkward, I guess, is
I think
the
that makes
point.
sense too. I mean, one of the things I try to do with my boys at times is just remind them that what we do have is a blessing. And I just, hey, this is God's blessing. We don't have this because mom and dad paid for it. We have this because God provided for it. Like I try to remind them of that when we go on trips, when we go on. I think that the pride side would like to say, yeah, your parents did this for you. When in reality, I'm sitting going, I don't want to take credit for that. I want them to see that this was God's ultimate provision. Right.
Yeah. No, I
So,
totally failed at this last night. We were watching we were watching a movie, and if you've ever seen Saving Mr. Banks, or I think that's the name of the movie, it's about Walt Disney trying to get Mary Poppins, and she had a really he had a bad dad, she had a bad dad, blah, blah, blah. And I looked at the kids and I said, see, I'm not that bad.
Yeah.
But I think probably a more appropriate response would be like, see, look how God is actually, come around in your life, that generationally moving forward. And I think that's one thing that I was, and just came to mind as I was reading this morning is, if you're in a position, let's say you're a first generation Christian and you don't have that background because you did have, rough upbringing, you're the generation maker. Like, you are what turns the generation into the direction of God and his holiness and faithfulness. And that is a story in and of itself. So I think that's awesome. Now, when it comes to teaching his character, what do you do?
So very practically, for one, let me just skip down in just Deuteronomy 11:26. It says, "Look, today I'm giving you the choice between a blessing and a curse. You'll be blessed if you obey the commands of the Lord your God I'm giving to you today, but you will be cursed if you reject the commands of the Lord your God and turn away from him and worship gods you have not known before." Now, here's where I want to tie that in is you have a choice.
Yeah.
Your decisions will determine the direction and quality of your life. Your choices.
We don't like to talk about that, though, do we?
Right.
We like to talk about the obeying blessing part, but we really don't like talking about how our decisions, our choices, can lead us into disobedience and therefore into discipline.
Yes, choices, your decisions, not your desire, not your convictions, but your choices will determine the direction and quality of your life. That's one of the things my boys have heard multiple times. They're going to hear. But some of the ways we practically are trying to do it is I want to see them develop their own faith. And so some very practical things that my father-in-law is doing with them is with all the grandkids. He's offered them basically a challenge, a 1-month challenge. They're going to read through a chapter of Proverbs a month, starting with April 1st. And there's in a journal, they're supposed to write down one thing and answer the question: What does this tell me about God? And let me think. We ask God, what do you want me to know, and what do you want me to do, and just write that down.
Okay.
And then they'll do that for a month. And if they do it for the whole month, he does something with them and for them, and they have a blast. And he's done this one time before. Now, personally, one of the things I do is I think you still use it, our Daily Bread devotional deal.
Absolutely.
There's one for teens on the Bible app.
Really?
Yes. There's one for teens.
I didn't know this. Educate me.
Plan
on the Bible app.
Yeah, on the Bible app. And so we started that plan, and on the way to school, I was having them read it out loud, but it'll read it to us out loud. So I just turned it on in the car. It was too hard to get them to read it loud enough for the other person to hear. And so it'll read it to us. And then afterwards I'm like, all right, so what do we need to know from that? What does that tell us? And
you have an opportunity though to talk about the character of God, and you've created that environment, that ecosystem via that app.
Yeah. And then the other thing that we do is that on Sunday I ask, what did they talk about today in the student ministry or in intermediate, or if they came to the service, hey, what did you think about what we talked about today? What stuck out to you? And we'll just have a conversation. Here's the deal. I'm not asking for a deep theological explanation. I just want to make talking about our faith and what God's teaching us normal and natural, and give opportunity for us to walk into where there's tension in the culture, between the culture we live in and the character of God. And how do we resolve that tension?
Yeah,
no, it's not
normal.
So,
and there's a lot of pushback on that. Now, finally, Chris, we talk about teaching relationship, right? Teaching how to have a relationship with the Lord. And so, one of the things I do in this area is I talk about my own relationship, right? And so I'll let you go second. But one of the things I do is I talk about my own relationship. I talk about the realness and the rawness of it. I don't think it should come as any surprise that it's not always rainbows and butterflies. And sometimes, I have to sit down and go, Lord, this is what's going on. And I'm not I'm not excited about it or whatever, or vice versa. You sit down
Yeah.
and tell the Lord, like, I am so like happy that you've given me an opportunity to whatever the case may be. But I try to talk about that with the kids because I want the kids to understand that from on a personal level, God doesn't want us to come with our shiny cellophane best. He wants us to come as we are. He
No.
wants us to bring what it is that's coming, that's bothering us, or what it is that we're carrying, and just set it down and be like, Lord, I'm being real about this. And that sometimes is good and sometimes it's not. And I tell my kids all the time, like, God is big enough. Trust me. He's big enough to take whatever ugly you have and listen to it, right? There is that
Yeah.
fear of the Lord and that respect, but he wants us to come as we are. He knows how we are. We're not fooling him if we come with this fake, facade and this fake thing. So I try to tell about my own relationship and how I approach him in the morning. And when things are good and bad, that's how I talk to my kids about it, so that they see that uh, as an example, as a mirror, or some sort of an image for them to actually to follow. What about you?
Yeah. I want them to know that I spend time with God. It's totally okay with me if when they wake up I'm reading the Bible. I want them to see it. I want
Yeah,
them to
right.
know
Yeah, I
with
know.
the daily. I want them to know that that's what Dad does on a daily basis, and that it's not perfect. That they know that there's days that I struggle and I got to get caught up here or there, but it's also just talking about when with this house journey, it hasn't happened as fast as we wanted it to. And there's been days I've been frustrated, and we've had honest conversations about it.
Yeah.
And hey, here's what God's teaching me. And here's what we need to learn from this. And you know what? God's timing doesn't always work out with the way we think it should, but will
Right.
we still trust him? Will we still do it his way? I mean, could we have already bailed out and done it our way? Yeah, we could have, time and time again. But
Yeah.
it's ultimately what am I trying to teach my kids is that you know I want them to see that I'm willing to trust God even when it doesn't take trust if it doesn't challenge what you want and your desire and your comfort, and so that I'm willing to just trust God and continue to walk in faith.
Yeah, and when they get to see that, that's the big thing. And so, if I were to put a bow on today, and then I'll pass over to you for kind of like maybe last thoughts, is so fun fact is because we both were reading the Bible yearly plan. We didn't hit Deuteronomy 11 at the same day, but it did stick out to us. And so I
Yeah,
think that's kind of important for folks to understand, is that, asking that question, what's sticking out to me? What can I learn? What does it tell me about God? Those are important things. But the takeaway that we hope you kind of get today is that, and it's funny, both of us captured the exact same thing, is that while it is good to have a reminder for yourself, there is an educational responsibility that we have for the next generation, to teach them about the things that God has done for us, to tell them about his character and his commands, and then to demonstrate that relationship with him in a way that's meaningful, and that they walk away wanting that relationship with the Lord for themselves, and they continue to grow there.
yeah.
And so we hope that if nothing else, you kind of grab that. Where are you at? We'll wrap today because we're kind of at the end of our time, more or less. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah, I got to
yeah,
go pretty
last,
soon. Lots going on, but I think it just comes down to this. I would say this as a pastor, a guy who's been student ministry for a long time. God wants you, if you're a parent, grandparent, He wants you to pass it on to the next generation.
yeah,
Partner with the local church, absolutely, but don't believe that it's their responsibility. It's God's called you to. Now, I get that not every kid has a family that who comes to our church, and we're going to continue to pour into that generation. But the reality is that many of those who are listening today, you don't have to be years down the road in your faith. In
mm-hmm,
fact, it is great for y'all to grow together, learn together,
yeah, be the
and
generational
just
change.
because here's the reality. You don't have to have all the right things to say, because what is seen is so much louder than what you'll ever say.
Mm-hmm.
Just follow Jesus by demonstration. Let them see you follow him and tell them why you follow him, and let God work it out.
Amen.